Picture this, a scorching afternoon in southern Cuba. Inside the U.S. base at Guantánamo, a sharp crack underground. Then silence, the showers stop. Not a drought, just Fidel Castro who literally turned off the tap. Cuba declared, not a single drop for the Americans, and the U.S. calm as ever like they already had God's playbook. Within 2 days, they cut their own pipes and built a desalination plant. Saltwater became fresh and pride became fuel. From that moment, Guantánamo turned into the world's saltiest island, living on distilled water and pure stubbornness. If U.S.-Cuba relations were a neighborhood, it'd be two armed neighbors sharing a fence. One locks the faucet, the other drills his own well, both muttering, "I'm the one who's right." But pause for a second. If Castro dared to cut the water, why not cut the base itself? Why not take it back? Because this wasn't about war. It was about dignity. A small island facing a giant and proving it could make that giant thirsty. Guantánamo became the perfect Cold War metaphor. Fresh water vs. salt water control vs. independence, two currents that met and refused to mix. To America, it was a strategic faucet in the Caribbean. To Castro, a bone stuck in the throat, too painful to swallow, impossible to spit out. So Cuba fought with symbols, cutting power, cutting water, cutting ties. While on the other side of the fence, U.S. sailors sipped coffee made from seawater and smirked. It's fine, Fidel, salt water still brews coffee. The strangest battle of the Cold War, no bullets, no blood, just pride and salt. And if you think it ended there, think again, because behind every drop of that water lies a century-old lease Cuba never renewed and could never break. To find out how it all began, we have to rewind to 1898, when America first realized it really liked tropical islands near Florida. Every neighborhood feud starts the same way, not with a fence, but when one guy suddenly moves in next door. By the late 1800s, Cuba was a war zone. 30 years of fighting, Spain left the island in ashes. Then in 1898, an American battleship, the USS Maine, blows up in Havana Harbor. No one knows who did it, but U.S. headlines explode louder than the ship itself. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. America jumps in, beats Spain, and declares proudly, Cuba is free, free just not alone. At first, Washington promised not to take over, but by 1901 came the Platt Amendment, the diplomatic version of sure, I'll leave, but I'm keeping a spare key. It let the U.S. intervene anytime its interests felt threatened and lease land for bases. In 1903, they picked Guantánamo Bay, perfect view, great real estate, and signed a forever lease. $4,085 a year, cancelable only if both sides agree. That's not rent, that's squatting with paperwork. Cuba protested, but U.S. troops were still on the island, so no wasn't really an answer. Every year since, America's mailed the same tiny check about what it costs to rent a Miami studio, a quiet note that basically says, your house, my key. Guantánamo became America's ink stain on the Cuban map, the kind that never washes off. Most thought the story ended there. It didn't, because decades later, a bearded man would grab a microphone in Havana and roar, Guantánamo is not America's. And from that moment, this polite landlord-tenant deal turned into one of history's pettiest and most unforgettable neighbor feuds. If history were a marriage, then America and Cuba were that couple who just couldn't figure out how to divorce. After leasing Guantánamo in 1903, the U.S. built a base, planted trees, raised its flag, and acted like it inherited the place from grandma.
We reserve the right
Cuba
to
stayed
intervene.
quiet, not from love, but from fear. Every protest met the same threat from the Platt Amendment. If you endanger our interests, we can intervene. Translation, talk back and we'll visit with battleships. Then came Franklin D. Roosevelt, charming, smiling, impossible to avoid. He launched the good neighbor policy, which sounded nice, like saying, I won't meddle in your business anymore, but I'm still keeping my garage on your lawn. So in 1934, a new treaty of relations was signed. America dropped its right to invade, but kept Guantánamo Bay. And it added one little line that would haunt history. The lease ends only when both sides agree. Sounds fair until you realize one side's too big to say yes
Here you
and
go.
the other's too small to say no. That's not a treaty. That's a legal bear trap, a marriage contract where only one partner holds the divorce papers. From then on, the U.S. mailed its annual $4,085 check, and Cuba let it sit, collecting dust and resentment. Someone joked, if those rent checks were flowers, Guantánamo could decorate every wedding in Havana. No one laughed, because for Cuba, every check was a reminder that independence came with fine print. Over the years, that temporary base outlived wars, presidents, and ideologies, just close enough to command the Caribbean, just far enough to deny it's part of America. Roosevelt wanted to be the good neighbor. Instead, he built a perfect legal cage, a contract so tight, even revolutions couldn't pick the lock, or as Havana likes to say, Guantánamo is like an old wedding ring. America won't take it off, and Cuba can't wear it. If Guantánamo was America's rented room, then by the 1950s, the whole Cuban house was basically on airmen. After the 1934 treaty, Washington didn't need gunboats, just greenbacks. They sent dollars, not destroyers, and in return got cigars, rum, and a first-class seat inside Cuba's economy. Fulgencio Batista wasn't just president, he was CEO of Cuba, Inc. He knew the secret to power. Keep America's wallet warm and you'll never sleep cold. Soon U.S. companies owned everything, electricity, sugar, railroads, even hospitals. And Havana, oh, Havana turned into the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. Neon casinos, mob bosses, jazz, and smoke. Frank Sinatra sang under chandeliers, while Batista's soldiers kept the poor outside the doors. People joked that if you dropped a coin in Havana, there was a 70% chance it rolled into an American pocket. One Cuba sparkled with rum, mambo, and chrome Cadillacs. The other lived in darkness, farmers, shacks, barefoot kids. The city ran on American electricity, but only 1 in 10 rural homes had light. Cuba became a mojito in a glass, sweet mint on top, bitter sugar at the bottom. By the mid-50s, Batista's rule was pure fear. Jails full, press silent, protests crushed. And out of that chaos rose a young lawyer with a beard and Broadway-level passion, Fidel Castro. He swapped the courtroom for the jungle, leading a handful of rebels into the Sierra Maestra. Armed with rifles and stubborn faith, they turned whispers of rebellion into wildfire. As rebels closed in, Batista still trusted his American lifeline. The lights at Guantánamo glowed every night, a lighthouse whispering, "Don't worry, we're still here." But by 1958, Washington's patience
Maybe it's time we
burned
stop
out.
sending guns.
No more guns, no more support. And Batista finally learned the golden rule of dictatorships. Lose America and you lose everything. On New Year's Day 1959, he fled with gold in his suitcases and shame in his passport. Castro marched into Havana as the crowd roared, believing the island was finally free. But when he sat down at his desk, his eyes fell on the map. And in the bottom right corner, it still read, Guantánamo Bay, U.S. Naval Base. Batista was gone, but a $4,085 lease still held the island hostage. A piece of paper that would outlive both men and turn a revolution into a 50-year argument over rent. When Castro took Havana in 1959, he didn't find treasure, he found a check. Amount $4,085. Memo, rent for Guantánamo Bay Naval Base. He held it up, smirked. Rent for land that's mine. For the U.S., it was pocket change. For Cuba, proof that part of its soil still flew another flag. Since 1903, Washington had mailed that same check like clockwork. Old governments cashed them without blinking. But Castro saw it for what it was, an IOU from an empire. He declared the lease void. Then, in a twist of irony, one Cuban official accidentally cashed it. The U.S. smiled. Thanks, Fidel, that means the lease still stands. A $4,000 mistake that history would never let him forget. Furious, Castro vowed never to touch another check. Decade after decade, the U.S. kept sending them, and Havana just stacked them in a dusty drawer, a pile of yellow paper smelling of pride and mildew. Only one was ever cashed, the accidental one from 1959. a financial scar in a Cold War marriage that refused to end. Castro didn't fire a shot, but he nationalized U.S. companies, banned the dollar, and declared, "Cuba will never kneel before money." Washington answered with an embargo, and Guantánamo became a fortress of flags and silence. Two neighbors, one fence, zero eye contact. A metal sign between them read, U.S. Naval Base under lease. Castro knew one bullet meant war, silence meant weakness, so he fought with symbols, cutting water, cutting power, cutting ties, but never pride. When asked if Cuba would ever get Guantánamo back, he smiled. They can keep it, but they'll never have Cuba. A response like black coffee, bitter, bold, and wide awake. One check, one island, two definitions of sovereignty. To America, it was a contract. To Cuba, a scar, and between them, 45 square miles of history. No one dared to cross. In 1961, Cuba was like a house that just changed owners. But the neighbor next door still had the spare key. Castro had barely kicked Batista out when word spread. The Americans might be coming back. Washington believed one push would topple Castro. So the CIA trained 400 Cuban exiles, promised a 72-hour victory, and called it the Bay of Pigs invasion. But Cuba wasn't a startup, and Castro wasn't an employee you could fire. On April 17, 1961, they landed on the southern coast and were met not by cheers but gunfire. Castro roared on national radio, "This isn't an invasion against me, it's against the Cuban people." 3 days later, it was over. The invasion collapsed. A tiny island of 11 million had just humiliated a superpower. Castro became a hero and the CIA's obsession. Assassination plots, sabotage, embargoes, buzzing over Havana like angry mosquitoes. Every strange plane, every shadow on the radar. Was it a spy or the start of war? And when he looked southeast toward Guantánamo, he saw the unthinkable truth. If the U.S. wanted to invade again, they didn't need ships. They already had a base inside Cuba. 45 square miles of American power, a dagger aimed straight at Havana. Castro warned, no one fires a single bullet at that base, because one spark could burn the whole island. He knew the U.S. could survive embarrassment, but never casualties. One stray bullet near Guantánamo could mean bombs over Havana, so Cuba fought with patience, not gunfire. They built fences, posted guards, and planted miles of cactus, the cactus curtain, a living wall of spikes and symbolism. From then on, Guantánamo became the coldest border in the tropics. One side blasting country music, the other revolutionary anthems. A few meters apart, yet worlds away. Sometimes silence is survival. Castro learned the hard truth. America could lose battles, but never its pride. So he switched to diplomacy as warfare. Speech by speech, he told the world. A piece of Cuban land remains under American occupation. A war of words, no bullets, no peace. And as the microphones cooled, the world was heating up. The Bay of Pigs wasn't the end, it was the prelude. Because 1 year later, Soviet missiles would arrive in Cuba, and Guantánamo would glow red on the world's nuclear target map. If 1961 was soldiers, 1962 was missiles. After the Bay of Pigs humiliation, Washington looked like a man slapped in public, still smiling, already clenching his fist. Castro knew the next round wouldn't bring rifles, it'd bring bombers. Khrushchev, eager to flex Soviet muscle, quietly shipped nuclear missiles to Cuba, each capable of hitting Washington in 15 minutes, and Guantánamo in 15 seconds. A Soviet officer later recalled, if the U.S. attacked, Guantánamo was to be erased in 30 seconds. 45 square miles, fuel tanks, barracks, and a nuclear bullseye. One wrong signal and paradise would vanish. October 1962. An American U-2 spots the launchers. Kennedy fumes, Khrushchev panics, and Castro, stuck between giants, feels both proud and doomed. He tells Moscow, if America attacks, press the button. Cuba would rather die with honor than live in humiliation. It wasn't a movie. It was the end of the world almost. While Washington and Moscow played chess, Cuba wasn't even invited to the board. So Castro sent a letter, 5 conditions for peace. 1, end the embargo. 2, stop assassination plots. 3, respect Cuban waters. 4, respect Cuban skies. 5, return Guantánamo Bay. Kennedy read the list and laughed grimly. 5 things America will never do. He told Khrushchev, "This is between superpowers, don't let Havana meddle." And Khrushchev, tired of Castro's temper, quietly agreed. By morning, Cuba's voice was gone from the table. October 28, the world exhaled, missiles out. Invasion canceled, peace restored for everyone except Castro. He finally saw it. Cuba was never a player, just a square on the board. "They played chess," he said, "with the blood of my country." When the dust settled, Guantanamo was still there, untouched, defiant. The U.S. doubled its troops. Cuba planted more cactus. One side blasted Elvis, the other replied with haste to Semper. Both claimed victory, only fear truly won. After 1962, the Cold War cooled, but this border stayed hot. For America, it was a trophy, for Cuba, a scar. And decades later, long after the nukes and speeches, the fences of Guantanamo still glow every night, whispering the truth that history refuses to admit. Some wars never really end. 3 years after the missile crisis, Cuba still lived in the shadow of one word: nuclear. The missiles were gone, but the embargo stayed. And every night, Guantanamo still glowed, its floodlights shining not into the sky, but straight into Cuban pride. Castro looked toward the base and sighed. "We can't fight them, but we can make them thirsty." February 6, 1964. Cuba shut off the main water line to the U.S. base and waited. The world held its breath. Would this be the spark? But America didn't shoot, they just grinned. Within 2 days, Navy engineers built a desalination system, salt water in, coffee water out. While Cuba tried to make its neighbor thirsty, the neighbor replied with science. That's when Castro learned, you can cut the pipes, but not the power. Inside the fence, sailors showering, beer-chilled, country radio playing. Outside, Cubans watching the American flag wave over Cuban soil. A reporter joked, "They're a fence apart and a century apart in technology." Castro didn't fire back with bullets, he fired with words. "On Cuban land," he said on live TV, "they drink water filtered from our sea." It sounded funny, but it was one of the sharpest speeches of the Cold War. The U.S. added more barbed wire. Cuba answered with thousands of cactus spikes. The world nicknamed it the Cactus Curtain. One side stood for technology, the other dignity. Between them, a strip of silence, where 2 radios played from different centuries, refusing to share a frequency. No gunfire, no battles, but every year Washington mailed the $4.085 check. And every year Havana left it to gather dust. 2 nations, 2 empires, 2 definitions of sovereignty. To America, a legal lease. To Cuba, a wound that wouldn't heal. A scholar once said, "Empires never really leave, they just renegotiate the rent." From 1898 to 1964, Guantanamo had seen victory, treaties, loopholes, gangsters, revolutions, and nukes, only to end with a broken pipe. A century of power and pride played out across 45 square miles of stubborn soil. 2 neighbors, separated by a few feet of fence, and thousands of miles of trust. Maybe their whole story fits in a single cup of Cuban coffee, bitter, hot, unforgiving, and neither side wants to be the one to pour the boiling water.